Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for December 9th, 2024, and I'm J.D. Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we get brutal on this episode.
Who's the brutal one, you or me?
I don't know. That is a great question. I'd say we're both brutally honest when it comes to our film analysis. We'll try to do the same
Well
thing
said, my
here.
friend. Well said. Well said.
Appreciate it. Yeah, we are here to talk about Brady Corbet's new film, The Brutalist, which is being heavily talked about this award season. The film, of course, debuted at the Venice Film Festival earlier in September, and it was nominated for the Golden Lion. It won the award for Silver Lion for Best Direction.
Yep.
It has received all kinds of critical acclaim. As of the day we are recording this, it received, I believe, 7 nominations for the Golden Globes this year.
It's doing very
well.
Yeah. I feel like at this point now, there are a few films we could say are front runners in some way. And The Brutalist seems to be one of those, based on the conversation we're seeing.
Absolutely. There will certainly be some awards talk on the main show this week and probably in the next couple of weeks.
Every
and months
episode
leading
until
up
the
to
end of the year.
Oscars. And of course, Shadon holding down the fort on Chasing the Gold. They'll certainly be talking about the Golden Globes and all of these critics groups and everything leading up to the Oscars. There will be plenty of awards conversations to be had. And The Brutalist is certainly going to be front and center in those conversations. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And we're here to talk about how we feel about the film. Where do we sit on
this
Brady Corbet
17-hour epic?
Yep. Now, before we get into it, let's quickly revisit Brady Corbet as a director. He's, of course, been on camera as well. I believe... Was that how he started his career in the industry? Was as an actor, I believe.
I believe so, because one of the films that you and I both loved during one of our past retrospectives was Mysterious Skin from 2005. Yes. He has a very good role, a very prominent role in that film. First thing I ever saw him in was Michael Haneke's American English language remake of Funny Games.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was kind of terrifying in it. So like I always took notice of him as an actor, but as a filmmaker, I guess he's I know he has 2 major films, including The Brutalist. I think there might be one more that he made before Vox Lux, which I have not seen. I've only seen Vox Lux.
The Childhood of a Leader is
I have not
his
seen
other
that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've not seen that one.
Yeah, I have not seen that one as well. I have heard good things, but the people that say great things about The Childhood of a Leader also say great things about Vox Lux, and I was mixed on Vox Lux. I did not quite love it as much as everyone else apparently did, so I don't really know. I can't really say on Childhood of a Leader. However, given my reception to Vox Lux, I was certainly curious for The Brutalist, especially given its price tag and how it looks. That is such a fascinating narrative that is counterculture to Hollywood standards that we've been talking about incessantly over the last 2+ years.
Honestly, it doesn't even matter who makes a movie like this. You and I tend to get excited when any movie comes around that just has this like sense of scale to it in some way, right? And even prior to seeing any marketing, even knowing the fact that this movie is 3.5 hours long with a 15-minute intermission, depending on how you see it. The movie just looks and feels massive. It really does. And the conversation already around it has made it seem even heavier than it has any right to be, perhaps.
Absolutely. And we'll certainly talk about the aesthetic of the film and how that money was well spent for sure. Circling back to Corbet as an actor, though, you mentioned Funny Games, Mysterious Skin, which is an incredible movie. There are a lot of films he's been in, really, even since the inception of this show, going back to late 2012, where more than half or around half of his acting filmography has been in alignment with the existence of this show. So, like, you can go all the way back to Marcy May Marlene. He's in that film. He's
That's
in
right, he is.
Melancholia.
Yeah.
We talked about Clouds of Sils Maria here on the show. He's in that.
Yeah.
I don't think we ever talked about the film Eden, but I absolutely did see that in 2015, I believe, is when that came out here. Force Majeure, which I really loved when that came out in 2014.
I thought that was called Downhill.
For some people, it might be called Downhill.
For the uninitiated, it's called Downhill.
Yes. Saint Laurent is another film that I've seen while we're young. I really like that film a lot as well.
Oh, yeah, he was in that. I forgot about that.
Yeah, so he's been in a lot of films that we have either reviewed here on the show or that we've talked about in some sort of way.
Yeah.
And of course, going back to the retrospectives, we, of course, have seen Funny Games and Mysterious Skin in the last several years as well. So, like, he's an actor that we've covered quite extensively. And then there's Vox Lux, his not directorial debut, but a film that certainly put him on a pedestal as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways for a lot of people. So here he is with The Brutalist. And for reasons we'll get into, this is certainly going to be a defining step in his career. There's no doubt about that. So, with that said, let's go ahead and jump into The Brutalist.
Let's get brutal.
It is, of course, directed by Brady Corbet. It stars Adrian Brody, Guy Pearce, Joe Alwyn, Felicity Jones. Who else? A lot of others that come and go throughout the film.
Who else? Who else do we want to call out? Alessandra
Ralphie
Nivola, I think we
Cassidy.
should probably call out as well.
Alessandra Nivola, for sure.
Yeah.
I'd say that's, our major cast that we'll be focusing on for this conversation. If you're not familiar with The Brutalist, when visionary architect Laszlo Toth and his wife Erzsébet flee post-war Europe in 1947 to rebuild their legacy and witness the birth of modern America, their lives are changed forever by a mysterious and wealthy client. Dun, dun, dun.
For a movie this big, that's a very simple plot synopsis.
Let's go ahead and jump into this. Brennan, what did you think about The Brutalist?
All right. I've only had about 24 hours to let this one sink in. So let me just get that off the bat. This movie is a lot. And there's a lot I'm still waiting to let sink in. I need to really, as we sometimes say on this show, JD, we have to sometimes let films marinate before we can really give, no pun intended, concrete thoughts on a movie.
Very pun intended. Come on.
That's very pun intended. I say no pun intended, but I definitely did that on purpose. So what I can immediately say about The Brutalist is it might be the most momentous film of the year. The whole thing is constructed like a monument, and people have called the film monumental, but I almost think that's a very literal description of the movie. It has a sense of scale that might even make it has the sense of scale that might even make it a grander film than something like Dune Part 2, considering how its scale is also kind of integral to the film's plot in many ways. It's actually like part of this story, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And that bigness is why I was always invested in this story and curious where it was going to go. I never really felt the 200-minute runtime here. So that's a testament to how well the film is paced. So I really did appreciate that. I'm really interested to see where this conversation goes because, like I said, I've only had 24 hours to sit with it. At this point, it's not one of my favorites of the year, but I'm pretty sure you're much higher on the film than I am, which is why I'm really excited for this conversation to see what other perspectives you can bring to this. I'm not sure at this point if it has the same level of stimulation or staying power for me as other films of its kind, ones that depict the timeless story of the American dream and the fallacy and the myth of the American dream. This film has been compared a lot to movies like Citizen Kane or There Will Be Blood. I mean, it's very much a Great Gatsby-like tale. It's a tale as old as time, right?
Mhm.
I'm wondering if it has the same level of emotional pull as some of those films did for me, and maybe I just need to give this film a different lens and really think about what other attributes it's offering, because it does have other ideas on its mind outside of just the myth of the American dream. That is certainly
For
part
sure.
of it, but there are
Uh-huh.
more things happening here. I'm I'm just not sure if it had that same like momentous quality underneath. I guess to put it in architectural terms, I think I like the design more than I do the foundation, if that makes sense. And I'm
Okay.
still kind of wrestling with that. I do really like the movie. Don't get me wrong. I just, as far as major awards players this year, there are a few others I do prefer at this point.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, I do find it very intellectually stimulating.
I love the way you
Um,
said that. I love the way you
Thank you.
said that.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you've seen the film, you certainly get the joke there.
Hmm, hmm.
But in all seriousness, it is kind of wild to me and maybe ironic that this is a heavy contender for Best Picture and other awards this season, because
Hmm.
it isn't exactly subtle with its thematic underbelly, anchored by
Hmm. Hmm.
two images that I think define this film and its powerful symbolism. One of them
Okay.
is on the poster. As you may have seen, it's a staggering shot of the Statue of Liberty. The other is of a cross near the end of this film as sunlight hovers over what is the remains of abandoned promise. In both of these images, the main object in focus is upside down, framing
Yeah.
that is very intentional, as it's a scathing reminder of the lie that is the American dream and the vacuous theology that preaches it. The conviction of this film is palpable. The way it deconstructs the American ethos with this deep bitterness is wild to me. The way it highlights the frailty of the American dream, the idea that this country is based upon, and how it's
Hmm.
supported by a disingenuous faith, religion being another staple of America's DNA, is nothing short of riveting to me. I don't want to say that the film is anti-American, because in the end there is a message of hope and how you can overcome the abuses of the system.
Hmm.
But man, I think there is a lot of irony if this wins Best Picture in a year where the political stakes in this country have never been higher. I already believe that this film will age gracefully as one of the best of 2024, maybe even of
Yeah.
this decade. But depending on
Okay.
how
Okay.
this second Trump term goes, we may be looking at this film as one of the most ironic and prescient films ever made. And perhaps that's
Okay.
where there are extra layers of conversation to be had with this film. Not that we have to get too deep into the weeds here. That might be a separate conversation for another time. I
Yeah.
do
See
think
how
this
well it
film
ages
is,
and see what kind of conversations it stimulates as the years go on.
yes, because I
Yeah.
think the film is great on its own terms, which will be the nucleus of this specific conversation.
Hmm.
However, the context in which this film comes out with this current political climate and how it also tethers to Judaism, whether that be in the United States or elsewhere in the world, that is
Hmm.
also a part of this movie. I think the timing of the release of this does give it an extra emphasis that may or may not make it all the more captivating as the years go on. I
Hmm.
certainly lean toward the idea that it will only add to the provocative nature of this film and why I think it's so enthralling. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
I still think on its own terms, though, the cinematography is sensational. The
Yeah, I agree.
score is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Adrian Brody and Guy Pearce have never been better. They're both phenomenal. The whole cast is really great, but there's certainly more of an emphasis on Brody and Pearce, and they
Yeah.
really do deliver in their
They're very good here.
performances.
Yeah.
The sound design is very good. The costuming, the way this film immerses you into its time period and aesthetics. Again, all under what, $7 million
Mhm.
is truly a miracle. It is phenomenal. The
Yeah.
scope and scale of this film, how it looks, the way the craft just pops off the screen. It's quite remarkable. See, this is a film that it's great on its own terms, and the way and the context in which and when it comes out, I do think gives this film an extra heft that no other film this year really has.
Yeah, I do agree that the film on its own terms, regardless of the sociopolitical context surrounding it in our lives, in America's lives, really, the film on its own terms has so many redeeming qualities. It's hard not to really love it for those reasons, for just those reasons on its own terms. The movie is, I mean, it's so monumental. It's structured almost like a symphony. I mean, we talked about the fact that it has this intermission, but it also has an overture, which is why, in many ways, the musical score here by Daniel Blumberg, which I agree is very good, it almost feels like a character here. In fact, it actually is a character here. The aesthetics of the movie are very much characters within this story. In some cases, the art direction, the cinematography, the musical score, at times they're even more interesting than the actual characters of the story themselves, which I think is actually very purposeful. I do think that this is a movie that is about the art just as much as it is the artists. And that's something that Brady Corbet has talked. Yeah, he's talked about that as well. I may get to that a little bit later. Where I think this movie does have perhaps some staying power that you're talking about, and where I think it could potentially age pretty gracefully, it's really where it goes in its final 30 minutes. The final 30 minutes are the best parts of the movie for me. And that's where I think it starts to unravel and peel the onion back a little bit further and showcase some new layers to what is already a timeless story. If you look at this movie as purely just the fallacy of the American dream, you can easily compare it to the likes of, like I said earlier, Citizen Kane, There Will Be Blood, many timeless examples of that. And I think those are better examples of that particular theme. But where it goes in the final 30 minutes, the film starts to add more layers regarding the immigrant experience and how that relates to the American dream. And that certainly goes hand in hand with what you're talking about regarding the timelessness that it could potentially fit within. So I think that does add some of that context that you're certainly talking about. And I think that's where there is an emotional core that starts to unravel that was kind of there, but was sort of hidden. And maybe that was the point. I think Brady Corbet is sort of playing that very close to the chest before he's ready and willing to reveal that to us. And when it does become more about the immigrant experience as it relates to those of higher privilege who are willing to take advantage of their traits, I think that's where the film does have some power that I was like, oh, okay, now I see where he's going with this. It was kind of like that epiphany moment for me where I realized, okay, this is ultimately the point of this movie that I found really compelling.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do think, to speak to what you're talking about there, the marriage of architecture and art with how these characters are rendered, there is certainly a lot of intentionality with that tethering.
Yeah.
There's certainly no doubt about it. And I don't think it's trying to stray too far from the films, the aesthetics, the epic qualities of what makes movies what they are, especially when you're going back to the time period in which this film comes out.
It has a traditional sense to it, which I do appreciate.
Yeah, it is an epic reminiscent of yesteryear, the throwbacks to the scope and scale, the excess of the new Hollywood era. I mean, this is the literal definition of they don't make movies like this anymore. They really, they very much literally do not. But
for $7 million as well.
But I don't think it's imitation. This is Brady Corbet trying to reach the same heights as something like The Godfather. Everything is grand in presentation, whether you're talking about the cinematography, the setting, the architecture, the performances, the score, everything we've been talking about here. It is all gloriously imposing and redolent. And the way this film treats not just the craft here, but even in the context of the film, Laszlo's work of art, the architecture, it all is interwoven to the immigrant story here. And I do think there is some specificity to that narrative that differentiates itself from something like Citizen Kane, for example. And while there's enough here that is familiar. Again, I don't think the film is trying to stray too far from that line,
Oh,
but it
absolutely.
does
Yeah.
enough that is, again, whether intentionally or otherwise, it speaks to the exact circumstances that we as a society, as a country, find ourselves in right now. Right now. So this is a film that takes place, 70, 80 years ago.
Yeah.
And it is just as formidable to the context of which, of the year in which this film comes out. And that I do think will give this film some sort of staying power, because I don't know if politically things are going to change all that much over the next 10, 15, 20 years. One hopes that they do. We certainly hope that is the case, but there is something so cynical, perhaps. And I do think this is a film that is deeply cynical. It is deeply bitter, as I noted in my opening thoughts.
Yeah.
When you deconstruct the American DNA and what it is founded on, it is founded on religious hypocrisy and the American dream. And the problematic blemishes that are at the root of those things have not changed in 250 years. That is what this film is trying to highlight. And that does give it some fascinating specificity in terms of when this film takes place, but again, how it correlates to today. And I like how that breathes life into this film, how it breathes vigor into it, again, while still invoking that 1970s new Hollywood aesthetic. I just found it ravishing here.
Which is, in a way, it adds a really interesting irony to the film, because this is an architect, Laszlo Toth, the character's name, played by Adrian Brody, who specializes in an architectural type called brutalism, right? And that is in the title of the movie, which is in many ways like the movie here itself. Brady Corbet's creation is sort of representative of an art from a bygone era. It's sort of like a lost art in many ways, because if you look at the history of brutalism as it's evolved, it became sort of replaced by postmodernism in the 1980s and the evolution of architectural, design there. So in an ironic way, it's showcasing an old style of art to suggest how nothing has changed, right? Which is essentially what you're talking about, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. And that's why I think both the immigrant side of this conversation, which I mentioned earlier, as well as the artistic side of this conversation, I think is maybe where the film has additional layers that are really compelling. I mentioned earlier that Brady Corbet himself has sort of made this film as a reflection of his own experience and the struggles he has had when making movies. The kind like the pushback he would have against an American system, if you will, to make the movies that he wants to make. I forget where I read that. It may have been an interview he had with Variety or some major publication where he talked about that very thing. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, so I'm obviously paraphrasing here. But in many ways, that struggle to hold on to the artistic vision that you have in a similar way to Laszlo Toth here, and how they get stripped away by those higher powers of privilege as the movie represents here. That's something that he has personally dealt with. And he's using someone like Laszlo Toth as his cipher, as his surrogate in a way, to tell a similar story in a more historical lens. I think those parallels are certainly fascinating.
No, I completely agree. I do think there are some fascinating parallels when you're coming in as an outsider, and Brady Corbet perhaps saw himself as some sort of Hollywood outsider, coming across people that might have saw some sort of promise in him and gave him an opportunity, but obviously kept coming across those different hurdles that we're talking about here. And it's interesting because from my understanding, at least, I mean, I don't know him personally, but I don't think he is of Jewish descent. I don't think that is the case. I'm fairly certain I have read that, which is what makes the context of this film perhaps all the more interesting. I don't know what inspired him to write this specific narrative, like using that crux to tell this specific story. Why, as a Gentile, he comes into this film to tell this film about Laszlo. That I'm sure he's been asked that question. I haven't.
I do think that's interesting. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's very
think that's
interesting.
interesting.
We've
Yeah.
we've talked about this before. Sometimes there are movies that we see where it might be fair to criticize the filmmaker for telling a story that's ultimately not their story to tell. But the other side of that conversation is, what if a filmmaker is willing to learn from that other experience that's not theirs and put themselves in their shoes and try to do
Yeah.
right by that other point of view, right? I think that's
Yeah.
just as rewarding in a different way, and perhaps that's what he's doing here, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, I think so, because that broader idea of being an artist and confronting those in power
Mhm.
who have hired you to do a job and coming across those varying challenges, that is certainly
Yeah.
here. But I think when you break it down to the individual, there's certainly many more nuances there. I think that's what makes Laszlo such a fascinating character, right? Because before the war, he is this celebrated architect in Hungary, where he comes
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
After the war, he's just another Jewish immigrant who escaped to the United States. He has no choice but to reinvent himself in the aftermath of World War II. That idea alone, I think, is really compelling here. And
Sure.
initially, it's very challenging. It's just a matter of survival, which is hard enough when you're homeless and hungry, but even more so when you're addicted to opioids, something that was also born out of escaping the war for Laszlo.
Yeah.
Eventually, he gets hired to work for Harrison, the Guy Pearce character. And so Laszlo is given a chance to regain some of his identity that was broken because of the war. From there, it's really fascinating to see how this film builds him up just
Yeah.
to tear him down. And again, the film's themes are not subtle and all of that, but the nuances of Laszlo's journey, the way he becomes emotionally volatile toward everyone around him, how he becomes a victim of American capitalism and greed and religious forces, all of that I do think is really staggering. And it's also worth noting that while all of that is very much true, the film goes out of its way to show us that Laszlo is far from innocent. And I don't just mean his drug addiction, but the film wants to raise questions about the cost of your art and pursuing the American dream. Because Laszlo, more often than not, chooses his art over those around him, those that are close
Oh
to
yeah,
him. There are
he's quite a
interpersonal
jerk at times.
ramifications.
He's quite a jerk at times.
There are interpersonal ramifications that he has to grapple with. He is constantly being pulled at both ends, and you start to see the wear and tear on him, not just mentally or emotionally, but even physically, to the point where he becomes completely broken by the end. And I do think that's what I find so fascinating about the character in comparison to other characters that kind of come from these huge epics. So, for example, I've seen this film compared to villain protagonists like Michael Corleone or Daniel Plainview, which those two films we've already mentioned, or even Lydia Tarr. I've seen that thrown out there in comparison to this. I don't think Laszlo is a villain protagonist like those characters. I don't think that he is.
I
There
agree with
is
that. I
empathy
agree
to
with
be
that.
had with Laszlo. He just at times is his own villain. And there is a big difference between the two.
Yeah.
And how this film deconstructs that, giving him empathy, but also demonstrating his glaring faults, the cost of him pursuing his art, not just on him, but with his wife, those close to him, how it completely breaks him down. While, again, him becoming a victim of American greed and religiosity, those two things working congruently together. Man, as you said to begin all this, it is a lot.
It's a lot.
It
Yeah.
is a lot, and I found the film spellbinding as it conveys all of that.
Yeah,
to
so
us.
what will we say? A villainous victim or victimized villain in a way? He's got both traits happening simultaneously. He's got the
Right.
double V action happening here.
Yeah. He's a victim, like he's a victim of the broader American greed, capitalism, religion, but
Oh,
a
yeah.
small he becomes a victim or a villain of his own victimization.
Yeah,
I
but
guess.
at the same time, though, like many victims of the American dream, they find their souls being corrupted in the process. So they
Yes.
start to kind of inherit the traits that make the American dream such a myth and such a villainous thing, maybe in its own right. So that's maybe where Laszlo starts to develop some of those villainous qualities in a way that seem very superficial like that. But it's because he's absorbing some of the traits that are taking advantage of him in the first place, which is why the film also weirdly reminded me of this is going to sound like a really strange example, but I was weirdly reminded of Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. And there's even a moment
Okay.
here in The Brutalist when he's referred to, Laszlo specifically, is referred to as a tramp. And
Mm.
if we remember when we talked about City Lights during our Charlie Chaplin movie series some years ago, we talked about how fascinating it was how the tramp, as he, spends time with the rich billionaire while he's drunk, he kind of starts to absorb the bad behaviors of the rich, right? He kind of like finds
Sure.
himself divulging in those
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah.
I kind of saw some similar things happening here with Laszlo, that he's becoming suffocated, almost engulfed by the mentality and the
Mhm.
corporate operations of the American dream, that he's starting to inherit some of those bad traits himself. And that's maybe where the victimized villainry that we keep talking about here is weirdly at its most balanced. And I
Mm.
do think that Adrian Brody does a very good job straddling that line. I think if there
Yeah.
is an element to his performance that I would say is the most complicated thing, it is trying to balance that line.
Yeah.
Without going too far on one extreme over the other, I think he does find that balance fairly well.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I think that is absolutely what's happening with Laszlo in this film. As I noted earlier, he escapes the US and he gets an opportunity to reinvent himself. I mean, he really
Mhm,
had no opportunity but to
mhm,
reinvent himself. He's thrown into a different country abruptly and really doesn't know anyone when he first arrives aside from his cousin.
mhm,
And through a series of perhaps coincidences, he finds himself where he gets an opportunity to engage in his art once again,
mhm.
but this time through the prism, the lie, but the
Yeah,
prism of the American dream. And who wouldn't want to indulge in that if
yeah,
given the opportunity? You understand why Laszlo, and in the beginning, he does demonstrate humility. He's often
mhm,
quiet and reserved. It's not until the project gets off the ground where there's actually shovels in the dirt, concrete being poured. When the community center starts to come together, that's really when Laszlo starts to embrace the American dream. I'm a
mhm.
part of this. I can do this.
Yeah,
And yes, he starts to emulate that behavior that he sees
mhm.
in the Van Burens. And of course, and the film, as we noted earlier, builds him up very intentionally in that regard because
Yeah.
once we get through intermission, oh boy, does the film have just the greatest of times pulling that rug from underneath his
Oh, yeah,
feet.
I mean, Adrian Brody starts to have a lot of fun with his performance, which is what makes the final 30
Yeah.
minutes so fascinating to me, because that's where it feels like Brady Corbet as a storyteller is finally starting to pull the rug from under our feet, or under our feet rather, because that's where he starts to introduce a different context to Laszlo, where, oh, this is actually about something more, and there are certain mistakes that he makes that he's willing to reckon with, and
Mhm.
it adds an emotional core that, not to say wasn't there, but it's almost like it was waiting for the right opportunity to reveal itself.
Mhm.
And I think that's like, I
Yeah.
actually think that's good storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, the last 30 minutes or so, I think, is where the film certainly becomes at its most aggressive with its
Hmm.
commentary. But I do think there are some key events that take place even before we get to that point, whether it be with
Hmm.
the niece of Laszlo, there's some circumstances with her, even
Yeah.
with his wife,
Hmm.
and the promise of a potential career. There's everything with the project. and where there's some hurdles, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, slight spoiler here. This doesn't reveal major events at the end of the film, but halfway through this film, there is an explosion that puts the construction of the community center at a halt. Actually, no. Let me backtrack a little bit. I do want to get to that here in a second.
Right.
There's like right before that, there's some sort of conflict as for like they bring in a second architect that that Harrison had worked with previously on a different project.
Yeah, I
and
think the
he has
character's
his
name is
own ideas.
Leslie or something like that.
Yeah.
Is it Jonathan
And-
Hyde that plays him? I haven't seen him in a long time.
Yeah. And once this other architect, like he has some other ideas, in order for Laszlo to maintain the integrity of his initial design, his vision for the project, and again, to reiterate, this community center, at least in its beginning stages, is entirely Laszlo's design, right?
Yeah, it's his baby.
And it's new, it's different, it's invigorating. He's bringing in, as Brendan mentioned earlier, that brutalism that is wonderfully in contrast to the Pennsylvania steelworker, blue collar aesthetic and mentality that this film reminded us of several times earlier in the film. I absolutely love that contrast.
Oh yeah.
And so Laszlo, it's his design, it's his baby. Once there are opportunities to save costs by doing other things, Laszlo, again, going back to the ideas of the cost of pursuing your art, throws his own money, his own personal money, his own commission at the project to make sure that those costs are covered. So that way his vision can stay in place. Like, that is absolutely a fascinating component of this film. And then soon after that, you get the explosion, which adds on to the continued assault of his his specific journey,
especially the repercussions that lead to that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course that leads to some major ramifications that he and his family have to grapple with. So like, I do think there's a lot that the film does. Again, a lot. We'll be saying that
it's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a
Small
lot.
film. It's a very small film, right?
Yeah. But there really is a lot that the film is doing, even leading up to those final 30 minutes or so. And yeah, you're right. I mean, once it starts to crystallize, I mean, boy, does it do that in some staggering fashion. But I do like the storytelling here, how it continues to build and build and build on Laszlo's story, his personal journey, the relationships he has with all these characters. I think there's a lot of texture there.
There is, yeah. And you're right that it's not really all that subtle. In fact, up until certain points, the actual narrative framework itself, it's not the most unpredictable of stories. There are things that happen that you would obviously expect to happen. Really, it's the final 30 minutes where I felt like I was finally being surprised by something, which is why I keep referencing that, just from a narrative standpoint. There are even some confrontations that happen between characters. I won't get into details for spoilers' sake, but there's a particular moment between Harrison Van Buren and Laszlo Toth in Italy that involves a drunken escapade of sorts. And I could see it. I knew that was coming a mile away, even way earlier in the movie, but that's not a bad thing. Like, the movie's kind of setting that up. It's pretty obvious that that type of exchange, I'll simply say, is going to happen. That type of assault is about to happen.
I agree.
But the film's not trying to subvert those types of expectations. It's trying to utilize a traditional narrative framework to add those additional layers that you're talking about, which I do think make it a very good movie. It's just by the time we get to those final 30 minutes, it has a completely new trick up its sleeve by offering a completely new lens. It's like, oh, okay, there's a new emotional layer to this that I'm liking this. Yeah, this is really cool.
No, I agree. I do think this is a classic tale of execution.
Yes.
There is nothing here that is new by film standards. I cannot reiterate that enough.
Mhm.
I don't know if I articulated that with cogency earlier as much as
You
I
did. You did.
tried.
Yeah.
But I don't think this film is trying to reinvent the wheel. It really isn't. What it is trying to do, though, is bring in some specificity that does make it distinct from something like The Godfather or Citizen Kane or many other films that have tackled the American dream in some sort of way. And especially given the timeliness and the context of 2024, as I noted earlier. But I do like how it sticks to that familiar, so it can simply play in its sandbox with the aesthetic and the scope and the scale of this film, these characters and performances, and also really dig into the specificity of the American dream and its marriage to Christian nationalism, and how that relates to, or not relates to, but how that's in contrast to Laszlo and his identity as a Jewish person. And that's another element of this film I want to talk about, is that dichotomy of Judaism to Catholicism or Christian nationalism, however you want to phrase that there, because man, that is such a big part of this film. That is another key aspect to this movie, right? So Laszlo, of course, coming across the ocean as World War II is ending. As we noted earlier, the only person he knows is his cousin that takes him in at the beginning. And then his cousin, Attila, I'm not sure how you say that.
Attila, I believe, is how you pronounce it, if I'm not played by Alessandro Nivola.
Yes. Yeah, in a small, brief role. But he tells Laszlo that he changed his surname. He changed his name to be more Catholic. And he even changed his accent. That's something Laszlo notices. Hey, you don't, like your accent is all gone.
He kind of sways back and forth at times, which I think is what makes that performance really crucial to those points.
It is absolutely crucial in those opening scenes for sure. And it catches Laszlo off guard initially, but it doesn't take long to understand why Attila assimilates, given what Laszlo goes on to experience. He is discriminated against often. Sometimes it's subtle. A lot of the time it isn't. For example, a major chess piece in the film is the reservation about his work, because the community center that he designs is for a Catholic town. And not everyone is happy about Laszlo being the architect, given his Jewish heritage. At one of his lowest moments, a character, which I won't reveal for spoiler reasons, but a character venomously tells him that they only tolerate Laszlo.
I was literally just about to say that. I was literally just about to reference that quote. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Good stuff.
Yeah, inferring that he's no one special. He's not good to the people of Pennsylvania. He's just good enough of an architect for them to tolerate. And one of the film's most pivotal scenes, after a horrific sequence of events, Laszlo stops going to service, which invokes a profoundly disturbing question. What does it say that the Holocaust did not break Laszlo's faith, but American capitalism did? Now that is a fascinating layer to this film, and one that deeply affects not just Laszlo, but his wife and their niece that also emigrated to America. In fact, one of the key dramatic through lines in the back half of the film after intermission revolves around the niece character, Sophia, and her boyfriend, husband, I'm not sure their relation, but they want to move back to Israel, so they're not religious outsiders. And after a while, Laszlo's wife, Elizabeth, voices that she wants to move to Israel because America is quote unquote too rotten. The film is very obviously anti-capitalist, but equally vital. It's how it denotes the importance of Christian nationalism as a tool for power, as a way to discriminate under the guise of righteousness. It will certainly anger some folks, but there's really nothing more American than that. And again, it's those two ideas separately are nothing new, maybe even together, but how it manifests in this film, I do think is quite powerful.
Yeah, it's an interesting irony knowing that here comes this immigrant over to the United States, which is known as the land of opportunity, that doesn't present that opportunity to him in the way that he was hoping for. How ironic that it's a nation that was very heavily involved in ending the war for their benefit, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
you would think, oh,
Mhm.
I'm going to the land of opportunity that gave me this opportunity in the first place, only for that opportunity to be stripped away from them due to their own
Yep.
growing concerns of here are these immigrants coming in. Are they
Yep.
going to strip our American traditions away from us? And when
Yeah.
you say it that way, I mean, you can look at it from that perspective, and there's still potentially an interesting story there. But this movie's not interested in that particular side, which is fine. That's not what it's going for. But
Mhm.
it's definitely something that's worth having a conversation about. I don't disagree with that. And that's where Brady Corbet is able to find some hidden layers in a very traditional story, which is narratively similar, as we keep saying, but as we keep referencing movies that it's being compared to, whether it be There Will Be Blood, The Godfather, Citizen Kane, whatever, The Brutalist doesn't feel like any of those movies. To
Yeah.
make a further pun here, it has a brutality to it. There's a griminess to this one by comparison. It doesn't have a similar tone compared to those, which I think is another way that execution
Mhm.
matters. It's able to stand apart from those other examples.
For sure. And quickly to circle back to what you were saying about the irony
Mhm,
of the United States going over to the war, winning the war, freeing the Jewish people from the hands of Nazi Germany, and
mhm,
then these characters coming back, these individuals coming back to America, such as
mhm.
Laszlo, the Laszlos of the world,
Yeah,
only to then find themselves up against an American ethos that really doesn't want them around.
right.
When you tether that to the context of today, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds here because we are not a political podcast by any stretch of the
We're not.
imagination, and I am
No.
not an expert in this subject matter at all. However, I do find the conversation really interesting because, as we noted earlier, Courbet comes in as a Gentile filmmaker. There's been certainly plenty of conversation already whether this is a pro or anti Zionist movie. I certainly do not have an answer in
Mhm,
that. However, I do think that at the very least, this film makes a cogent argument for why Zionism is appealing for certain people,
yeah.
such as Laszlo and his wife Erzsébet, and even their niece. You, at the
Mhm,
very least, understand why they either make that choice or contemplate making those choices.
mhm.
And I think, again, what's interesting when you throw in the context of 2024, and I'm not going to get too much into this because we're not a political podcast, cannot emphasize that enough.
We're not? Oh, I
But
had no idea.
I do think that the way this film draws parallels to Israel and America and how they are ironically tied together, for as much as we talk about the irony of, in the context of this film, how there's a separation between Christian nationalism and Judaism.
Mhm.
In the context of 2024, at least at the political level, there's more parallels than there's contrast there.
Mhm.
And it's just really interesting. Like, I don't know what this film is trying to say and all of that. I have no
I
idea. And but I can see the argument both ways. And again, going back to some of my opening thoughts, I think that's why over the next 5, 10, 15 years, when we look back at this movie, the timeliness of it, I do think is going to be such a crucial piece of it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. A movie like this, and this is why it's pretty smart what Brady Corbet is doing, is that he's not getting too specific with any one theme or any group of themes. So that
Yeah.
way, it probably does have the potential to age pretty gracefully because as times change and we may see some things change in our current climate as well, it may shape the movie in a new way
Mhm.
by keeping things pretty unsubtle, I guess, in the context of this movie. It's able to evolve within whatever those circumstances are, so which is a pretty smart thing to do. So you're right. I think seeing what this movie has to say down the line, what it has yet to say, honestly, it's almost like the film itself has a mind of its own that it hasn't quite revealed to us yet, and it's waiting to see how times evolve to see what it has to reveal and what it has to speak to on those times. So there might be some new things to shed a light on as the years go on. Maybe another review 10 years down the road to see what happens.
For sure. And look, I'm talking in a lot of vague terms because I don't really have an answer as to what the film really wants to invoke. And maybe to your point, Brennan, it is doing that very intentionally just to simply invoke the conversation.
It doesn't have an answer yet, but it's one of those movies that will eventually reveal an answer given what our climate suggests, and it'll find it.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is, when I seek out the conversation around this film, it does seem as if, while we're talking about it vaguely and the film is probably speaking in those broad terms as well, when you see this film and when you understand the context of today and even of the time, the late 40s, 50s, and then into the 60s where this takes place, I think it how you feel about those things will immediately come to the surface. So I think ultimately it's going to be interesting to see how this film shifts, how it evolves over the next 10 years. I think is going to be, something to keep an eye on. But I think that's, again, why I think there's a lot of irony about this film maybe winning the Oscar this year, if it does go on to win the Oscar for Best Picture. But even when you remove all of that aside, that's just an extra component to this film that makes it all the more striking to me. But I do think, again, on its own terms, Laszlo as a character, his wife, when she comes into the fold as well in the back half of the film, the dynamic between Laszlo and Harrison really throughout the entire film, how that involves is utterly captivating. I mean, again, you can talk about the filmmaking and the scope of everything here. Laszlo arriving in America, that tracking shot, that one take early on is one of the best openings of the year. That is phenomenal.
The Statue of Liberty reveal with that musical score coupled to it is it's kind of breathtaking, honestly.
It's so good. Or you think about the overture, the bus ride. That whole moment in the film is absolutely incredible as well.
And I will say, going back to my opening thoughts where I said I do really like the film, I'm just not sure how much I truly love it yet. I think I said that I think I like the design more than I do the foundation at this point. And perhaps the reason why is, I wasn't able to put it into words, but given this conversation, I think I did have this sinking feeling that this is a film that I personally need to see how it ages in the next few years before I can really definitively say, oh, this is something special. And I'm not quite there yet still, but I have, given this conversation, I am liking the movie a little bit more. Given the movies that are certainly up for major awards this year, there are a few others I still prefer. But of all of these movies that are major frontrunners or major contenders in some way, The Brutalist is probably the one I'm most curious about how well it's going to hold up in the years coming, which is
that's fair.
Maybe a bigger praise than anything else. That's not something we often praise movies, given that curiosity of how it's going to evolve or devolve. That's always an interesting thing. And I think this is a movie that's built on that potential idea.
For sure. And I do think one's personal politics will influence how you see this film. I don't know how you experienced it. I could not separate 2024 from this movie. And I don't know if you can. Given
I'm with you.
Conflict in the world, it is really, really hard not to think about that when watching this movie and what these experiences or what these characters experience, what they talk about in this film. Again, that duality of Christian nationalism, specifically Catholicism, but in essence, it's all functioning as the same thing here.
Sure.
and how that is in contrast to Judaism. I mean, you think about that in the world climate today, and it's hard not to separate that. So I think that could influence how a lot of people see this film. Maybe that's why I'm curious as to where this ultimately ends up in award season. Do enough people even consider that? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I am wondering how general audiences will react to this who aren't necessarily looking for those parallels that we keep talking about.
Yeah.
Then
maybe
again,
they
this
won't
is
see them.
well,
Or
that's
it
the
won't
thing.
bother them, I should say.
Well, that's the thing. It's like I think if this movie weren't 3.5 hours long, there actually is perhaps like a technical universality to this one. I actually think there is something to be enjoyed for those who just simply want a very traditional but thrilling American dream story. I think
Yeah.
the superficial levels there are compelling, and I think general audiences could latch onto those things. Really,
And that's yes. Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because even if you're anti-Israel in terms of the current political climate, I think there's a universality to this film that a lot of people can certainly relate with. And I do think its fundamental nucleus, as far as like the way it puts up a mirror against the American dream and how that is tethered to religiosity, that is, again, that's the story of America. That's something that's 250 years old and has not changed. And I don't know if that's certainly not changing in the next 4 years, maybe not even in the next 400 years, if America survives that long. I mean, those two things are at the very core of America.
Yeah.
And this film simply wants to put up a mirror to that. It just happens to use the context of World War II and these Jewish immigrants that survived the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of empathy. There's a lot of emotion to be had with that in this film that is absolutely fantastic on its own terms, especially when you couple it with the filmmaking and everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, especially knowing where Laszlo Toth's architectural influence stems from. We find that out towards the end. What's inspiring him to design the way he designs? There is, that kind of heartbreaking parallel there.
Yeah, and as I noted earlier, I don't see him as a villain here. I do see him, again, a villain of his own in his own story at times. But I think there's a lot of empathy to be had with him. Like, one of the more striking moments, and I'll be vague here not to avoid spoilers, because I think this should be left unspoiled, but there is a moment regarding his wife in the back half of the film that is, all pun intended, brutal to watch, because she's in a lot of pain and he is having to take care of her, and he's trying to come up with a solution to take that pain away. And once he comes up with a solution, it circles back to one of his own deep faults, a blemish of his that he has really struggled with. And when he makes that choice, I did find this emotional vigor to it. It's heartbreaking because it does offer an immediate solution, but you know that there's going to be a bigger ramification to it.
Yeah. It's the placement of that moment in the narrative as to why it works. Because it comes right after a really great scene between the two of them in a car, this argument that they have, which I think is, in many ways, that's really the turning point for me, and I think for many people. If that scene you're talking about came before that, it would have seemed a little cheap, honestly.
Yes,
I
think,
agree. Structuring it in that way, I think, is very smart.
And there's some great buildup, again, going back to that in this film, that leads to that really earns that moment, not just to what you're talking about, but there had been moments where Erzsébet had wanted to share some sort of intimacy with Laszlo, but he was too dedicated to his craft, too dedicated to his art. That was his primary focus. She became a secondary focus, and that intimacy was not there. It strained the relationship. But once he makes this choice to relieve her of that pain that she had been experiencing, it's immediately followed up with this moment of ecstasy
Yeah.
that stylistically it is a bit strange. It's almost like Luca Guadagnino's Queer entered itself into this film for about 30 seconds. And that's a film we're going to get to later on here in the next
It's
week or so.
not quite as hallucinatory as that, but I see the comparison.
But you know what I mean?
I
Like,
get
it gets
you.
a little out there.
At least by comparison to the more traditional framework of
Yes.
a movie like this. Yeah, okay, I get that.
Yeah, and look, it makes sense for the moment, given the context of what they're experiencing. I think that change in tonal direction makes perfect, and even aesthetic makes perfect sense for that moment. But like, yeah, I mean, but on an emotional level, like to see Erzsébet kind of receive that longingness that she had been experiencing, I thought was really great. So, yeah, I mean, I think like on its own terms, separated from the political climate of today, again, there's just so much to love about this film. I love the filmmaking here. I think from scene to scene, there's so much to dissect and talk about, whether they're talking about the dialogue. And again, man, some of the verbal exchanges between Harrison and Laszlo in this film are just absolutely riveting, sometimes quite funny even. But it's really great.
Guy
Obviously
Pearce's
gets hostile
introduction
at
is
times.
Guy Pearce's introduction with that library is pretty hilarious.
It's very, very funny.
Yeah.
And, you know, I joked earlier about, you know, how I found the film intellectually stimulating. I mean, that's something he says literally like 6 times. like my conversations with you are so intellectually stimulating. It's just so funny, like the way he says that line. It's really, really great.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. He's eating up the scene. Or every scene rather. He's having a lot of fun for sure. I don't know if this is. I hate to use the word hot or the words hot take because there's really no such thing unless you're really trying to provoke a response, right? But I think Felicity Jones might give my favorite performance in the movie. I think
She's
she
really
is
good.
terrific. I think she's terrific.
really good.
And maybe it's because she's. I don't know. This is not really a movie that's built on individual scenes that are really interesting to go back and revisit. The movie really works as a unified whole. It's one of those movies I feel like you have to always watch from beginning to end. But Felicity Jones perhaps gets the one scene that I'd be willing to go back and replay, which is towards the end. And that's all I'll simply
Like
say.
when she confronts the Van Buren's, I'll say vaguely.
Yeah. That's
I have that
that's
written
a
down here
powerful
as one of the
statement.
key scenes of the film. Yeah, that's such a great moment.
Yeah.
And again, I think maybe that's why, and perhaps there's debate to be had as far as whether she would enact in the same behavior regardless. However, I go back to that moment we mentioned earlier where she's able to crystallize that longingness with that moment of intimacy they have, regardless of the difficult, the arduous circumstances that led to the choice that Laszlo has to make there. But in the aftermath of that moment comes the Italian trip that they go on, which Brennan invoked earlier. And there's some awful things that take place while on that trip. And that whole sequence of events in the film, I do think is quite riveting on its own as well. And because of what happens there, it leads to Erzsébet confronting the Van Burens there. And again, just from a storytelling perspective, I mean, coming off the heels of that moment they had, you know, earlier in the film, it just gives it that much more of an emotional prowess. I mean, again, perhaps she would have reacted the same anyway because that's her husband and she's going to, you know, perhaps react accordingly because her husband experienced something.
It's basically the equivalent of Claire Foy's "You're all a bunch of boys" scene from First Man.
A little bit of that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. No, it's real good. And it leads to an ending that I absolutely adore, where it crystallizes with that that shot of the upside down cross, which I just find like it's incredible narrative storytelling coupled with lavish visual storytelling that again is just so reminiscent of those great American epics of the new Hollywood era that I just love. Again, like there's so much that is familiar to the film, or to audiences watching this, but
Yeah.
at the same time, like it's like it does it with reverence, and again, I don't find it imitation. It's inspired
No,
filmmaking is how
no,
I would describe it.
no. And sometimes the most inspired filmmaking is taking the familiar and making it not feel familiar, right? That's
Yeah, yeah,
that might be the
exactly.
hardest thing to do, as opposed to just coming up with original ideas, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we'll get to this here in a couple of weeks as well, but I recently saw Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, and you'll
Mm,
absolutely be able to say the same thing about that film.
hmm.
So much of it is obviously familiar. It's a remake of a classic movie,
It's a remake of a remake
and
of a remake in many ways.
exactly, it's a remake that's been remade a bazillion times. So
Yeah.
of course there's a familiarity to that film, but Robert Eggers just brings a craft that's undeniable. And I honestly, I would say the exact same thing about this film.
Okay.
That, yeah, sure, there's a lot that's familiar, but I think the craft is undeniable. Like there are
Hmm.
specificities here that I think are undeniable, that are really great. Um, and I absolutely love it. I mean, I guess, again, I could go scene by scene here, but I just want to note, like, one of the more riveting ironies, polarities here, that I think is really interesting,
Hmm.
is that moment or I guess that series of events in the first act where Laszlo is overseeing the construction of the community center as it's built up. And we talked about some of the dramatic tension that comes up when he has to
Yeah.
pay for, certain things that happen out of his own pocket and all that sort of stuff. But like just watching that unfold and how the film captures the sounds and the textures of industrial America. As we noted, this
Hmm.
taking place in Pennsylvania. The film often reestablishes the beauty and the historical importance of Pennsylvania as a blue collar state and how it helped shape America into what it is, and how that works in
Hmm.
contrast to Laszlo as this architect with modern designs that are vibrant with concrete and marble. Like it's just symbolically this fascinating way to denote how Laszlo is an outsider who is trying to infiltrate
Hmm.
America's core values. And certainly it's in the storytelling for sure, and in the characters, but a lot of that also is just in Corbet's direction, in the sound
Yeah.
design of the film, like letting that blue collar industrial
The
America just really come through to the surface. And visually, when you see the concrete of the design or of the communities that are come together, it's
Yeah.
just,
Um.
I don't know, that's such a
The
fun contrast here.
the constant reference to Doylestown, Pennsylvania. It was like, wow, I need to look this up because
Yeah.
Doylestown's very close to me. I've got close friends that live in Doylestown right now. Two of my bandmates live in Doylestown. We've played there many times. In fact, we call ourselves a band from Doylestown. It's pretty amazing. And nowadays Doylestown is not really like a manufactural industrialized place.
Mhm.
It's actually very village-like, which is kind of interesting. The events of this movie maybe want to do some research to see how much is actually pulling from true history as opposed to just having its own story to tell. And there are some things that Brady Corbet is pulling from that are somewhat factual. I guess Laszlo Toth was a real person, but he wasn't an architect. He was a Hungarian geologist, I think, that was
Mhm.
apparently most known for vandalizing Michelangelo's Pieta statue.
Mm.
So little
Wow.
difference there. But he's definitely pulling from real history to tell his own story. He just has like
Mhm.
bits and pieces of maybe factual evidence to add into this mix.
Mm.
But I don't know. It was kind of fun trying to devise what may or may not actually be true, especially given the fact that
Gotcha.
Doylestown is right up the road for me.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting, that you say that, because I've seen some conversation about how this does a similar thing with Tar, with that film,
Hmm.
where there's such a deep realism to the film that it makes you want to go and do some sort of research as
It
to, is this a real story?
it
Like,
makes you
are
think.
these real characters?
It makes you think. Wait, is this a biopic?
Yeah, like it's so immersive in that regard that, and Tar is very similar in that way as well. Like it creates such a vivid
know,
realism that
that's
it tricks you into thinking that
that's
it is real.
you
Yeah.
know, that's a good comparison. Not just in the trickery of making you think it's real, where you might think both movies like Tar and The Brutalist are biopics when they're actually not, but
Yeah.
aesthetically and tonally they are kind of similar, right? Even
Yeah.
even like the
Yeah.
overall like color grading and the hues of them, they have that
Mhm.
kind of concrete grayness to both of them.
Yeah.
I guess for lack of a better term, both films have a very brutalist mentality. They feel very
Yeah.
much like architecturally designed in a brutalist manner. Uh, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of movies that have that. It creates this kind of cold feeling, this very
Yes.
despondent feeling.
Yeah.
And this is definitely going for that as well.
No, I completely agree. I mean, as I noted in my opening thoughts, I do think this is a deeply bitter film, perhaps
Hmm.
an indignant one, but certainly one that has a lot to say about the American dream and the not just the lie of it, but the hollow hypocrisy of it all.
Hmm.
And again, I didn't even think about this until right now. And even though it is different, uh, like when you bring up something like the CEO shooter and everything that's taking place right now,
Hmm.
even though those events are obviously very different, I think it comes from the same spirit. This, when you think about the health system in this country and how it doesn't provide you anything. And for a lot of people, it leaves them in the same places that Laszlo feel like where he's at the end of this film,
Hmm.
where you're just broken and completely deflated at the hands of how America was built.
Hmm.
That's ultimately what is happening right now. So the events of the CEO shooter are obviously different. It's the same spirit
Yeah.
as this film is capturing, which
Yeah.
just kind of, again, adds to like, how are we going to look at this when we get away from the events of 2024? I don't know, but it's hard not to think about a lot of those things. I
Not
just
sure
find
if it'll
that
be. I'm not sure if
fascinating.
it'll. Yeah, I'm not sure if it'll be forgotten, and there's certainly going to be a
Yeah,
lot of enough people that keep talking about it for sure.
for sure. And circling back to Tar and the comparisons between the two, I
Hmm.
think what's also interesting too, and maybe this is slight spoilers as we wind down here, because I wanted to ask you about the epilogue to this film and the
Hmm.
speech that we hear from Sophia. And I'm going to
Yeah.
give it away. I'm going to give away a little bit of the speech at the end.
Hmm.
So fair warning for those that haven't seen it. But I was thinking about that. I wanted to bring it up anyway, and then you were bringing up Tar and
Yeah.
how they're so similar.
Hmm.
And the way this speech ends, when you correlate that to Tar, it just makes Tar all the more funny to me. However, and I wanted to ask you, at least, how it relates to the Brutalist anyway, because
Hmm.
she ends that speech by saying, "It's not about the journey, but the destination," which
Hmm.
is a subversive flip of the coin to how that phrase is often rung, right? Where
Hmm.
it's all about the process. You got to trust the process. You hear this all the time in sports, right?
Yeah.
It's not about the destination. It's about the process. The process will get us to the Super Bowl. The process will get us to the Stanley Cup, to the national championship, whatever it may
Hmm.
be. But here she ends it by saying it's not about the journey, but the destination.
Hmm.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think sometimes it's when you go through a journey like that, and I think especially in the case where a sociopolitical lens could be applied to it, I think maybe that's where the film is at its most provocative and maybe trying to find a place within our current climate as we keep alluding to. Sometimes the end point is when the impact is actually made. When you reach a certain endpoint, that's when influence actually happens. Whatever that journey is, sometimes no progress can be made. And I think that's ultimately maybe what she's saying, especially given Laszlo's journey here. His journey, there was a lot of back and forth, and no one really found any type of resolution until he was able to. I think if anything, it's really suggesting the idea of resolution being this sort of end goal here, and that's sort of an emotional one. I don't know. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I don't know if I have any sort of answer to it. I don't know if Brady Corbet has talked about this in interviews. If he
Yeah, I'd have to look
has,
that up.
I kind of hope to, and well, in some ways, I kind of hope to avoid it. I don't know if I want to hear him speak to this, although I'm sure he might or he will if he's been asked
He seems
about
like the
it.
kind of person that wouldn't answer the film for us, though.
No, I agree. I agree. I think he would probably sidestep it a little bit. But at the same time, if he did speak to it directly, maybe I would be curious to hear where he was, like what he was thinking when he threw that line of dialogue in there, because
Well,
you
yeah.
think about what Laszlo experiences in this film, and again, some of it is his own faults. Like a lot of what he experiences is his own doing, but a lot of it isn't. And at the end of it, given what we learn about him in that epilogue, where he ends up is the success of his life and his career ultimately at the hands of, everything that he did with Harrison. Like, did that shape him, or did he succeed despite all of that? The film seems to imply it's the latter.
Yeah.
And if it is the latter, how futile is the process for a lot of us anyway?
I think that's what it's suggesting, because that process that Laszlo found himself involved in became more of a hindrance, like a handicap in a way than anything else. And I think that final statement at the end of this movie is certainly more indicative of the artistic process, which goes back to something we talked about regarding Brady Corbet's own words, making a movie like this, and the like the frustrations he had trying to overcome a certain system, right? Because when you look at art that's created, for those of us that aren't the artists, that are just simply receiving that art, how can it make any difference if it's never completed and shown to the world, right? So the process of creating something like that can certainly be beneficial for the artist, but does it make any lasting impression if that destination is never reached, right? I mean, I think about my own band. We've written songs, we've released songs, they're on Spotify. Go check us out. What if we never did that? What if we just had the process of, writing stuff but never showcased it? We never made it to that destination to allow some type of impact to be had. And the same could be said about Laszlo and his work being celebrated because they're finished. He has something to show for it. And maybe that's what it's also suggesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, what you're speaking there too, in terms of the hurdles and the pain that it caused him, perhaps the journey, the process is something that is to be forgotten. And all that matters is the final outcome, the art that is to be had there. On the inverse of that, though, you think of something like Steven Spielberg's Jaws. The process is what made that movie what it is. You can't really speak about the outcome.
That is such a fluke to this whole thing, though. It's like such a lucky accident. But you're right. You're absolutely right.
But how many movies are like that? Or how much art in general comes out of those complications?
But still, in the case of Jaws, what if it was a hurdle to the point that he chose not to finish it? Then the destination's not met.
Yeah. I don't know. That's why it's such an interesting way to phrase that, or to even converse about it. I will say this: I think ultimately where the film is landing on that, as fun as it is to debate, that phrase, I guess. Ultimately, this film, I think, is, as we've been talking about, it is trying to hold up a mirror to the hollowness of the American dream and the vacuous theology that, sings its praises. There is nothing about the journey and all of that for Laszlo that was memorable, right? And the only thing that
didn't make much
matters
of a
is he
difference,
got to the other side of it. So
Yeah.
I think the film is trying to say the journey, aka what makes America what it is, like its core values. There's nothing to be revered there. It's just the destination, like what the American dream can bring you, like the other side of it. That's the only thing that matters, because in the middle, there's nothing but pain and hurt. I think that's ultimately what it's trying to get at there.
This is a
Which
mean
again
movie.
makes it
This is a
kind of a
mean movie.
bleak movie. It is bleak. I mean, there's a lot to this film that is arduous. And ultimately that's what I think it's getting at. And I don't know. I found it powerful, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely got me thinking, especially from an artistic standpoint. I think there is some vague truth to it for sure.
At the very least, it is intellectually stimulating.
All right, thank you, Guy.
Maybe we can leave it at that.
Is that the new In Session Film T-shirt? It's intellectually stimulating.
It must be. Look, I'm wearing our latest one. I'm going to talk about it on the main show this week if you want to go and get it. But I think that might have to be the newest one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll work on that in the next few weeks.
Don't you love when we have conversations that inspire new T-shirt designs?
I know. It's the best.
Yeah.
All right. The Brutalist is coming to theater soon on Christmas, I believe. Go watch it. It's a long one. It's 3.5 hours, but totally worth your time, I think.
What do we keep saying, JD? It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot of movie. A lot of really fun movie. Yeah, this film, and it's gonna win a lot of awards, or at least be nominated for a lot of Oscars. I just want to, I guess my last final thought, I want to emphasize the music one more time. Daniel Blumberg, terrific, absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And Lowell Crawley's cinematography is really, really great as well. I assume both of them will be nominated at the Oscars.
Yeah, I saw his name pop up. I thought his name was LOL.
LOL. I'm sure he gets that a lot. All right,
He probably
LOL.
does.
Let's talk about this movie.
He has shot quite a few great looking movies over the years. I think a very underrated one, White Noise, the with Adam Driver, the Noah Baumbach film. Yeah, I think that's a very intriguing looking film.
I agree. And of course, he did the last two Corbet films as well.
Yeah.
He did Andrew Heiss 45 Years. That's a great looking movie as well.
Yeah, for such a small story, you wouldn't expect the cinematography to be so crucial for something like that. And it's very good. Very good.
Very good.
And
stuff.
I'm with you as far as Vox Luck, Brady Corbet's last film. I'm very mixed on that one, but it's a good looking movie. There's craft there for sure. I agree. It's kind of one of those ambitious failures that we sometimes talk about, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, totally agree. All right. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here once you're able to see the film. We would love to hear from you. If you're listening via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Letterboxd. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. If you're watching on the YouTubes, you can leave a comment below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. We would greatly, greatly appreciate it. As for our other review, we are going to be talking about Amy Adams and Night Bitch. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be coming out later this week. Episode 614. We're going to be talking about the Golden Globes. We'll talk a little bit about the AFI Top 10 of 2024.
Wow, 2014.
We could talk about 2014 too.
Yeah, that was a good year.
It was a good year. But no, we'll talk about how award season is ramping up. And there was some Marvel news that dropped tonight.
We'll spend 30 seconds on that, and that's it.
Yeah. We'll spend the 30 seconds it deserves, but it's worth bringing up for the 30 seconds, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get a little villainous when it comes to those.
Yeah, a little villainous. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We'll have Chasing the Gold this week as well. Shadon is going to have a Golden Globes reaction podcast as well. That'll be up very soon. That actually might be available before the main show is. That might be the same day as this episode is dropped, actually. So
Okay.
you can be on the lookout for that. And we'll have a new women session later on in the week. With all of that said, Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Well, let's just once again emphasize this movie is 3.5 hours long with a 15-minute intermission. If you see it in theaters, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's not going to be for everyone, but I am genuinely curious to see how this one ages.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure that you use the bathroom beforehand. The intermission is 15 minutes. The bathroom's probably going to get pretty crowded. I didn't even attempt to go to the bathroom during that 15 minutes.
Good for you for holding it for that long.
I didn't drink any water. I went in super dehydrated. I did not want to miss a second of the film.
That's what we should put on the poster. That's the pull quote for this movie as far as a positive review. Go in dehydrated.
Go in dehydrated. Yeah. Exactly. You do not want to miss a second of it. Okay, well, with all of that said, we hope you enjoy it when it does come out. And we'll see how many Oscars it wins in the next few months. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Really good movie. I quite loved it.